Welcome to the ultimate unsolved serial killing and mass murder iceberg. Well, the bottom of it. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to cover this whole iceberg in this video, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to cover the last two tiers of this iceberg in a two-part series, this video being for the second to last tier. A lot of the upper tiers have a lot of entries that have been covered to death by other YouTubers, so I just want to touch on the most obscure and unknown serial killers and mass murderers to have ever existed. I think that's what people come to these videos for, to learn about the unknown stuff. This is going to be one of the darker videos I've made, so quick warning, I'm going to talk about some pretty messed up stuff happening to people. Also, consider subscribing if you haven't already, as it does really help me out. I'm not going to waste any more time, let's get into it. The Gold Sock Killer. This entry is referring to a series of murders known as the Gold Sock Killer incidents, which occurred in South Florida in 1973. Over a 6-week period, 3 women were murdered and 1 survived an attempted attack. Now, the weird detail about this case and why it's named the Gold Sock Killer is each victim was strangled with a men's sock, with the first 2 attacks involving a gold-colored sock. The subsequent attacks used differently colored socks. The victims were 42-year-old Jonina Kelpine, 17-year-old Teresa Ann Williams, and 16-year-old Mary Sue Curtis. There were indications of sexual assault in all murder cases, and an intent to rope in the attack of the surviving victim. Despite several newspaper articles covering these murders, there appears to be little to no information available online. The case remains unsolved, although there was a strong suspect, an 18-year-old already convicted for a similar crime, who was never charged with these murders. He is currently serving a prison sentence for another crime. The Manawa Ripper. I think this entry is referring to this theory proposed by Trevor Marriott in his book Jack the Ripper, the 21st Century Investigation, which speculates that Jack the Ripper may have continued his murderous spree beyond London, potentially committing further murders in Manawa, Nicaragua, and possibly Germany. Marriott, a former police detective, used modern investigative techniques to analyze the Whitechapel murders, suggesting that the killer could have been a merchant seaman traveling between these locations. He challenges the traditional view that the Ripper was a skilled surgeon, instead arguing that the circumstances of the killings point to a sailor who sporadically visited London. The theory is further complicated by the claim that vital organs thought to have been removed by the Ripper could have been taken post-mortem by body part traders. Marriott's investigations casts doubt on the conventional profile of the Ripper and expands the geographical scope of the investigation to include international locations where similar murders occurred. The San Eido Cannibal. This entry is referring to one of Argentina's most enigmatic criminal cases, known as the San Eido Cannibal. Active in 1972, this unidentified serial killer is believed to have murdered between 3 and 5 women and attacked several others. The killer operated in the San Eido area, ambushing his victims in secluded spots, raping and strangling them, and horrifically mutilating their bodies by biting off parts of them. Despite intensive investigations and the forensic construction of a denture model based on bite marks on the victims, the killer was never captured. The case remains unsolved, and it is speculated that the killer might have died, potentially killed by police, though his identity was never confirmed. Legrele. This entry was a little hard to research because most of the articles talking about it were all in French. This entry is referring to the case of Legrele, an unidentified serial killer and rapist active in France, who first struck on May 5, 1986 with the murder of 11-year-old Cécile Bloch. Over the years, Legrele was implicated in 2 more murders and 5 rapes. The nickname Legrele, meaning the pockmarked man, comes from his distinctive acne-scarred or pockmarked face as described by witnesses. The morning Cécile was murdered, her parents left their apartment, and her half-brother also left their apartment, leaving her alone. She was supposed to walk to her nearby school but never arrived. Her mother, upon failing to reach her by phone, learned from the school that Cécile hadn't shown up. Her panicked parents returned home, and with the help of their concierge, searched the building. Cécile's body was eventually found in the building's basement, wrapped in a dirty carpet with her school bag thrown nearby. Cécile had been strangled with a cord left at the scene, and her body showed signs of assault. Witnesses reported seeing a man in his mid-20s with short, light hair and large hands using the building's elevator around the time Cecil disappeared. This man, who appeared slightly unkempt and had facial skin marked by severe acne or smallpox, became the primary suspect. Despite numerous sightings and the release of a composite sketch, the killer, dubbed Legrele by the media, has evaded capture and identification for over 35 years. His crimes remain among the most chilling unsolved cases in French criminal history. The Gunma Family Murders. This entry is referring to the unsolved murder case of a family of 3 in Gunma Town, Gunma Prefecture, Japan, on January 14, 1998. The victims were a 48-year-old man who owned an electrical contracting business, his 48-year-old wife, and his 85-year-old mother. The perpetrator, identified only as K, a 28-year-old truck driver at the time of the murders, was determined to have stalked the business owner's daughter before committing the murders. The case remains unresolved despite intensive investigations. After the murders, K was seen drinking miso soup that the wife had been preparing, indicating he stayed at the crime scene for some time. His vehicle, a black Nissan Silvia, was spotted in Gunma Prefecture and Saitama Prefecture a week after the murders, but then disappeared, along with K himself. Police considered the possibility that K might have died by given that there had been no activity in his bank accounts and neither he nor his vehicle had been found. In 2007, the case was designated for a special investigative reward of 3 million yen, and jurisdiction over the investigation was transferred to the newly established Takasaki North Police Station in 2022. Additionally, the victim's family filed a lawsuit in 2018 seeking 137 million yen in damages from K, expressing profound grief and loss due to his actions. The case was featured in a reenactment on Japan television in 2019, which included live information collection at Takasaki Police Station. The Monsterland Hitchhiker Murders. This entry is referring to a series of unsolved murders known as I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the Monsterland Hitchhiker Murders, which occurred in the Monsterland region and the county of Bentheim, Germany from 1971 to 1974. 4 women, all around 20 years old, petite and dark-haired, became victims. They had all disappeared after entering unknown vehicles and were subsequently found strangled without any apparent signs of sexual assault. However, their bodies were posed unnaturally and partially disrobed, suggesting a ritualistic element. The perpetrator, dubbed the Monsterland Killer or the Hitchhiker Killer by the media, was never apprehended. The women came from different social backgrounds and did not know each other. Each victim was abducted and likely strangled shortly afterward. The crime scenes were not the locations where their bodies were eventually discovered, indicating that the killer moved them post-mortem. Despite extensive investigations, including the creation of a facial composite and extensive checks on vehicles, the case remains unsolved. This case represents one of the mysterious and chilling examples of serial crimes in Germany during that period. 2009 Saltovka Murders. This entry is referring to the Saltovka Murders, a grim case of triple homicide that occurred on February 5, 2009 in Kharkiv, Ukraine, specifically in the Saltovka area. The victims were discovered with multiple stab wounds and included a 40-year-old man and a 70-year-old woman found near a local church, and another 38-year-old man found across the street. The motives behind these killings were unclear, with robbery being a potential but unconfirmed motive. Within days of the murders, by February 9, police arrested 4 individuals, with 2 men, 20-year-old Dmitry Dorofeev and 24-year-old Alexander Makarov, both with prior criminal records, confessing to these crimes. They were reportedly driven by financial motives, leading to a detailed reconstruction of the crime by the authorities. However, inconsistencies in their testimonies during the trial, issues with their alleged murder weapons, and a successful challenge to their confessions, where they were claiming police coercion, led to a complicated legal battle. Despite initial confessions, both defendants later disavowed, claiming their admissions were coerced by police abuse. This claim was supported by the lack of concrete evidence linking them to the scene, apart from their own admissions. The case took a turn when surveillance footage and phone records supported their alibis, leading to further investigations that questioned the police's handling of the case. Ultimately, after a series of trials and retrials that included DNA tests and forensic disputes over the murder weapons, the court found the evidence insufficient and acquitted both Dorofeev and Makarov, with the murders remaining unsolved. The Limon Killer. This entry is referring to a series of murders committed by a serial killer in Limon, Costa Rica. The perpetrator, whose identity remains unknown, began attacking in mid-January and has claimed 4 victims as of June 10th. All the victims were homeless women who were addicted to crack cocaine. The killings took place within a 1,000-meter radius, with each victim found strangled and showing signs of sexual assault, which authorities considered to be the killer's signature. The latest victim, Melissa Marlene Morales Palma, was found near the main street at the Limon Cemetery, showing signs of strangulation and possible sexual assault. Her body was discovered close to where other victims were found, suggesting a pattern in the location of the murders. The serial killer is believed to operate near areas frequented by crack addicts. Local authorities had formed a special and interdisciplinary team, including psychologists, criminologists, and agents from the Judicial Investigation Organization, to intensify the investigation. This is the first time such a group has been assembled to track a serial killer in the region. However, significant leads have yet to emerge, and there is concern that the killer will continue his crimes, though this case did happen in 2011, and as of now, no killer has been found, so yeah. The Kigali Ripper. This entry is referring to a series of brutal crimes committed by an unidentified serial killer known as the Kigali Ripper in Kigali, Rwanda, starting in July 2012. The killer targeted prostitutes, murdering 4 women between July and August 2012, with each victim found strangled and some mutilated. The killings created a panic among the local community and prompted a police investigation, which has yet to yield significant result or capture the perpetrator. Despite several arrests and a coerced confession, the real killer remains at large, with murders attributed to the same individual continuing sporadically through 2014. The Ripper. This entry is referring to the resurgence of a brutal serial killer known as the Descuartizador in Costa Rica, who is believed to have resumed his violent acts in 2010. Initially active in the early 2000s, this murderer was notorious for killing and dismembering his victims, using precise tools like a butcher's saw or chainsaw. The killer's method involved removing the hands, feet, and heads of the victim, a pattern that began with the murder of young drug-addicted women in the early 2000s and continued throughout 2007. The latest victim, a young man, was discovered in parts across various locations, raising fears that the killer had returned and shifted his target demographic from women to men. Despite extensive investigations by the Organismo de Investigación Judicial, or the OIJ, the identity and motives of the Descuartizador remain unknown. Hercules. This entry is referring to a series of vigilante-style murders in Bangladesh attributed to an individual or group known as Hercules. The murders targeted suspected rapists, with at least 3 known incidents where the suspect were found dead, with notes confessing to rape attached to their bodies. These events, which began with a discovery in January 26, have incited fear of extrajudicial killings amidst growing frustration over the high number of rape cases and low conviction rates in Bangladesh. Local police and authorities are investigating, but no substantial leads or suspects have been confirmed. The phenomenon has sparked a broader debate on justice and the rule of law in Bangladesh, where extrajudicial killings have been a contentious issue. Hercules is viewed by some as a vigilante delivering much-needed justice. The Trofimov Beheadings. This entry is referring to the Trofimov Beheadings, a horrific mass murder that occurred on December 15, 2012 in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Judge Vladimir Trofimov, his wife Irana, and their son Sergei, and Sergei's girlfriend Maria were brutally murdered in their home. The judge and his family members were beheaded with a machete, with the bodies found without their heads. Sergei was reported to have been beheaded while still alive. The murders coincided with a judicial celebration day in Ukraine, and and the motive behind the killings remains unclear, though theories include revenge or theft, as Judge Trofimov was a noted antiques collector. This case drew significant media attention, underscoring issues within the Ukrainian judicial system. Beer Man. This entry is referring to the case of Ravindra Kantroli, who was accused of being the Beer Man, a suspected serial killer in Mumbai. In 2006 and early 2007, several murders occurred where the victims were found near beer cans, leading to Kantroli's arrest in 2007. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, as the media dubbed him the Beer Man due to the presence of beer cans at crime scenes. However, inconsistencies in evidence and witness testimonies led to his acquittal in 2009. Following his release, Kantroli opened a fast food stall, attempt to rebuild his life amid the enduring public stigma and media portrayal of his case. His lawyer, influenced by the dramatic nature of his story, wrote a movie script based on his experiences. The Sing Yong Dong Murders. This entry is referring to the Sing Yong Dong serial murders, which took place in Seoul, Yangshan district over the course of 2005 and 2006. During this time, 2 women were murdered and another was nearly killed in 3 separate incidents that occurred on public holidays, approximately 6 months apart. The victims were attacked with heavy objects, then sexually assaulted. Evidence suggested that all incidents were connected by the same perpetrator or perpetrators due to similar modus operandi and forensic findings. The assailants, who remain unidentified, attempted to conceal their actions by disposing of the bodies in secluded areas and by employing similar violent methods in each attack, including strangulation and post-mortem mutilation. The 3rd incident was interrupted when the intended victim managed to escape, leading to no further attacks in the area. Joro de Pver. This entry is referring to Joro de Pver, a nickname given to an unidentified serial rapist and murderer who was active in the Konyovica neighborhood of Sofia, Bulgaria in 1968. During that period, 6 to 7 rapes were reported. The moniker Joro de Pver originated from a paver found at the crime scene. Milsho Milanov, a deaf and mute individual from Rakita, was initially arrested and convicted as Joro de Pver. However, he was later released due to insufficient evidence. Subsequently, in the early 1970s, another criminal dubbed Joro de Pver II emerged, responsible for raping 10 victims and committing 2 murders. This perpetrator, Georgy Jordanov, was eventually caught and sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in 1975. The true identity of the original Joro de Pver remains unknown, and it is suspected that he may have been responsible for additional rapes in later years. The Ulan Udi Maniac. The Ulan Udi Maniac is an unidentified serial attacker in Ulan-Ude, Russia, known for a series of brutal assaults on women since 2016. The first known attack occurred on April 16, 2016, where a young woman was struck with a stone, dragged into the bushes, and assaulted. Subsequent attacks followed a similar pattern. Lone woman attacked with a heavy object, usually late at night near residential areas. The assailant is described as a young male, approximately 25 to 30 years old, with a slim build and likely of Asian descent, and he was last seen wearing a light brown jacket with a mid-thigh length hood. The attacks are characterized by the extreme violence and the precision of the blows, which led investigators to believe that they were dealing with a single individual linked by DNA evidence found on the victims. In one of the more chilling developments, traces of the perpetrator's blood were found on several items at the crime scenes, suggesting he might suffer from a skin condition that causes bleeding, or he may have sustained injuries during the attacks. The police have been actively collecting saliva samples from local men who fit the description of the assailant for DNA comparison. The investigation is ongoing, with the police urging anyone with information to come forward, assuring a reward for helpful tips. The Los Galindos Massacre. This entry is referring to the Los Galindos Massacre, a grisly event that occurred on a summer afternoon in 1975 at a remote farmhouse in Andalusia, Spain. The property, known for its agricultural output, was managed by a foreman named Manuel Zapata. The incident resulted in the brutal murders of 5 individuals, including the foreman and his wife, a young tractor operator and his pregnant wife, and another farmhand. The day of the massacre, unusual tasks were assigned to the farmhands, diverting them from the farmhouse, where the murders took place under mysterious circumstances. Initial observations at the scene included a fire, with bodies charred beyond recognition, and a trail of blood leading to the locked foreman's house. Inside, the foreman's wife was found brutally bludgeoned to death. Suspicion initially fell on the foreman, Manuel Zapata, as he was missing and his hunting rifle was discovered at the scene. However, the twist came 3 days later when Zapata's decomposed body was found hidden on the property, indicating he was the first to die and not the perpetrator. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation and deepened the mystery, as it suggested the presence of another party responsible for the killings. The massacre shocked the local community and led to a complex investigation marked by initial missteps, including a compromised crime scene and the late discovery of crucial evidence. 1900 Laila Murders. This entry is referring to the murders of a Laestadian merchant couple, Heikki and Maria Pajari, and their visitor Johanna. In 1900 in Finland, the couple was found brutally murdered in their home along with Johanna. The discovery was made by a worker who noticed an unusual scene through a window and sought help from neighbors and the authorities. The investigation into their deaths highlighted the community's tensions, with initial suspicion falling on Johan Ringvall, a builder and associate of the Pajaris. The case attracted significant media attention, with detailed court proceedings and public debates about the motives and identities of the perpetrators. Ringvall was eventually exonerated, and the true motive and perpetrator remained unclear. The Krasnoyarsk child murders. This entry is referring to the unresolved Krasnoyarsk, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, child murders, a crime involving the death of a group of schoolboys in Krasnoyarsk in 2005. 5 boys, aged between 9 and 12, disappeared in late April 2005. In May, their burnt remains were discovered in a city sewer. A criminal investigation was launched, initially focusing on kidnapping and later reclassified to murder. Despite extensive search efforts involving over 5,000 police officers and the use of a police helicopter, no suspects were identified. The investigation continued until December 18, 2007, when it was suspended due to the absence of any suspects to charge. The remains, found close to the boys' homes, included burnt clothing and fragments of bodies, leading to initial speculation of accidental death, though later statements from authorities suggested that the boys were murdered. The case remains unsolved with no definitive cause of death established. The Independence Avenue Killer. This entry is referring to Gregory Breeden, a suspect in a series of murders in northeast Kansas City during the early 1990s. Breeden was associated with the deaths of 7 prostitutes who worked on Independence Avenue. Their bodies were found mutilated and discarded in the Missouri River, some even as far as Lexington. Breeden was specifically charged in the 1996 murder of Viola McCoy, whose body was discovered near M291. Although he was never convicted of the murder, Breeden served 10 years in prison on unrelated charges of writing bad checks. After his release, he lived in a van and attempted to publicize a manuscript proclaiming his innocence in the Independence Avenue killings. Breeden died of natural causes in 2014, shortly after being released from jail on bond for a misdemeanor sexual misconduct charge. The Salvador Ripper. I'm pretty sure this is supposed to say the Salvador Ripper. I know I'm the grammar police. This entry is referring to a serial killer known as El Descuartizador de El Salvador, active during 2002 and 2003. The unidentified murderer targeted young women in the areas of San Salvador and Libertad, El Salvador. The killer's tactics involved picking up victims, taking them to secluded areas, and then murdering and dismembering them with a chainsaw. The remains were left in rivers, streets, and public squares, often with the heads placed in bags bags or backpacks. Despite the brutal nature of these crimes, the killer was never apprehended. There are also suspicions linking this individual to the murders of 6 women in Costa Rica, with possible connections to gang members from the Maras. The Dorchester County 3. So I couldn't find anything on this entry. There were no articles related to a serial killer when searching this up, so yeah, if you know about this, which is unlikely, put it in the comments. 2019 St. Louis serial killer. This entry is referring to the investigation into a suspected serial killer in St. Louis, as reported in September 2021. The St. Louis police, alongside the FBI, are investigating the murders of 3 individuals connected to sex work, identified as Pam Abercrombie, Casey Ross, and Marnie Haynes. These recent murders have close similarities to another unsolved series of murders from July 2019 in the East St. Louis area, which also targeted individuals linked to sex work, named Sandra Reckman, Bridget Williams, and Amanda Lee Garr. Additionally, there is mention of a possibly unrelated but similar series of murders in Dayton, Ohio, known as the Main Street Murders, involving the victims Jasmine Wadsworth, Crystal Garcia, and Amanda Fella. These cases are characterized by their targeting of vulnerable populations and the method of murder, raising concern about potential serial criminal activity across these regions. The Butterfly Hunter. This entry is referring to the Butterfly Hunter case, a series of brutal murders targeting transgender women along the Pan American Highway in Argentina during the late 1980s. These killings, which took place between Florida and San Isidro, involved extreme violence against transgender sex workers whose bodies were often left on the roadside. The term Butterfly Hunter emerged to describe the unknown assailants responsible for these crimes. Despite the high number of victims, with reports suggesting up to 28 by August 1987 and possibly as many as 60, the authorities frequently dismissed these deaths as accidents, leading to a significant lack of investigation. Survivor testimonies like that of Carla Pericles highlighted encounters with a man in a cream-colored car who attempted to attack her with a gun, which she managed to knock away before escaping. Other accounts described the assailant as having a scar on his face and using different vehicles. The murders were sensationalized by the press, which often speculated on bizarre motives and failed to hold the authorities accountable. Activists and researchers pointed to possible involvement by the local police and criminal organizations, noting that many deaths were not properly investigated and were often recorded as accidents. This case remains shrouded in mystery, with many believing it involved more than just a single perpetrator. Madman of the Route. This entry is referring to the Madman of the Route case, a series of murders that took place in Mar del Plata, Argentina from 1996 to 1999. The perpetrator, nicknamed El Loco de la Ruta, or the Madman of the Route, was believed to be responsible for the deaths and disappearances of 14 women, most of whom were sex workers. The victims were found mutilated and abandoned along highways, with some bearing inscriptions on their bodies. The first known victim was Adriana Fernandez, whose body was discovered on July 1, 1996. Other notable victims included Maria Amaro, found with cuts on her back, and Viviana Spindola, whose dismembered limbs were found in January 1997. The killings were initially attributed to a single serial killer, but this theory was later challenged. The investigation into these murders involved significant controversy. Some investigators believe that the murders were the work of a single psychotic killer, characterized by ritualistic and gruesome methods. However, others argue that the Madman of the Route was a fabrication created to cover up the activities of criminal organizations involving police, pimps, and possibly judicial officials. Among those who supported the serial killer theory was criminologist Osvaldo Raffo, who believed that the early cases showed signs of a single perpetrator's ritualistic behavior. Former Judge Pedro Federico posited that the murders were linked to a mafia that exploited and extorted sex workers. A significant suspect in these cases was Celso Errastia, who was found with items belonging to some victims and was convicted of 2 murders, Murders, though his connection to the broader series of crimes remains unproven. Despite extensive investigation and several arrests, many of the murders remain unsolved, and the true nature of the madman of the route remains a subject of debate among investigators. The Bra Murders. This entry is referring to the Bra Murders, a series of killings that took place between 1967 and 1971 in Stamford, Connecticut, where 5 sex workers, most of whom were black and struggling with addiction, were found strangled, sometimes with their own bras. The murders began with the disappearance of Rose Ellen Pasda in 1967 and ended with the discovery of Alma-T. Henry's body in 1971. Benjamin Franklin Miller, a self-styled preacher with a history of mental illness, was charged with the murders but later acquitted by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. However, suspicions regarding his guilt persisted as he provided inconsistent confession and recanted his statements. Another suspect, Robert Lupinasci, a known racist with connections to the red light districts, was linked to the murders but never charged. Despite evidence pointing to Lupinasci, he denied responsibility until his death in 2013. The true identity of the killer remains unknown, and the cases are officially unsolved. The Southern Harz Pensioner Murders. This entry is referring to Rudolf Leal, a German serial killer known as the Death Maker, who was active primarily in the Harz Mountain Range during the mid-1940s. Born on July 7, 1924, Leal's early life was marked by poverty and crime, leading him to support his family through smuggling and other illegal activities. Leal began a murder spree post-World War II. Between 1946 and 1947, Leal, along with accomplices Karl Hoffman and Konrad Schubler, murdered at least 10 women, although Pleo claimed to have killed 25 people. His victims were primarily women whom he lured with promises of helping them cross the border illegally. Pleo's methods included rape, bludgeoning, and strangulation. He was eventually arrested on April 18, 1947, following the discovery of Herman Bennen's dismembered body, whom Pleo had killed during a robbery. Pleo's trial drew significant media attention, as he often boasted about his crimes. Despite his claim of mental illness, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for multiple murders. On February 18, 1958, Pleo committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell. His gruesome crimes and the extensive media coverage solidified his infamy in Germany's criminal history. The COO Massacre. This entry is referring to the COO Massacre, a tragic event that occurred in COO, Braga, Portugal, on Sunday, January 31, 1999. 3 sisters, Maria Esther, Maria Olivia, and Maria Rosa, were brutally attacked in their home, which also housed the mini market they operated. On the day of the massacre, the sisters were absent from the delayed 9:30 a.m. mass, raising concern among the community. Customers entering the mini market found Maria Olivia and Maria Rosa severely injured. Maria Esther was found dead in her bed with 9 stab wounds. Olivia and Rosa, who arrived minutes later after Esther was attacked, were beaten with a heavy iron object at the entrance to the mini market. Despite surviving the initial attack, Rosa died the next day on February 1st, and Olivia succumbed to her injuries a week later. The crime scene was compromised as numerous people entered the house, contaminating potential evidence by stepping on clues, stirring objects, and disrupting the crime scene. It was discovered that around 100 euros in old currency were missing, suggesting a possible robbery. The weapons used were a knife and a pickaxe-like tool found at the scene. Various motives have been speculated, including drug addicts searching for money or family disputes, but no definitive conclusions have been reached. Nearly 100 people were questioned, but the investigation did not yield conclusive results. The crime officially expired in 2014, meaning the judiciary police no longer actively seek the perpetrator. However, the case could be reopened if new leads emerge. The Columbus Elderly Murder. What I think this entry is referring to is this guy named Carlton Michael Gary, an American serial killer known as the Stalking Strangler, who murdered at least 3 elderly women in Columbus, Georgia, and 1 in Syracuse, New York, between 1975 and 1978. Born in Columbus, Georgia in 1950, Gary had a troubled upbringing marked by poverty, malnutrition, and frequent relocations. He suffered serious head trauma as a child and had a history of heavy drug use and criminal activities from a young age. Gary's killing spree began in 1970 with the murder of Marion Brewer in New York. Over the next several years, he raped and strangled elderly women, often using stockings or other fabric. His victims were found in various states, including New York and Georgia, and he was finally apprehended in December 1978 for an armed robbery. In 1983, Gary escaped from custody but was recaptured a year later. Evidence eventually linked him to the earlier murders, leading to his conviction and death sentence in 1986. Despite his conviction, Gary's case was filled with controversy and allegations of mishandled evidence and police coercion. Supporters claimed that the evidence against him was weak and that racial bias may have played a role in his prosecution. In 2007, DNA evidence linked him to another rape and murder in New York, but he was not charged due to his existing death sentence. Carlton Gary was executed by lethal injection on March 18, 2015. The Godoy Murders. This entry is referring to the Godoy Murders, which inspired the Uruguayan horror film La Casa Muda, or The Silent House. The true story behind the film involves the discovery of 2 mutilated bodies surrounded by strange photographs in a remote country house in Uruguay during the 1940s. The case remains unsolved, and the film, set in the present day, attempts to piece together the final 78 minutes of the victims' lives. Screenwriter Oscar Estevez, who typically avoids horror films, channeled his fears of abandonment and the unknown to craft the narrative. Despite a modest budget of $8,000 and being filmed with a Canon SLR D5 camera, La Casa Muda achieved significant international success, even inspiring a Hollywood remake titled The Silent House. The filming of the movie was imbued with eerie occurrences, adding to its mystique, and it was dedicated to Alfredo Zorrilla, the terminally ill owner of the house where it was shot. The Coastal Road Killer. This entry is referring to the Coastal Road Killer, a serial murderer who operated primarily in Israel during the 1960s and 1970s. The killer is suspected of murdering around 16 young women, including soldiers, in brutal and similar manners across both the northern and southern regions of the country. The victims were often kidnapped after accepting rides and taken to isolated locations where they were raped and murdered. Despite numerous investigative effort and the deployment of advanced technology, the Israeli police have not been able to apprehend the killer. The murders were characterized by their occurrence between autumn and winter, and the killer's ability to evade capture by leaving few traces and exploiting stormy weather. The first known victim, Miri Almakayes, disappeared in October 1966, followed by other victims such as Miriam Penkus and Sarah Lipa, who were found murdered in the same area. Over the years, the investigations faced significant challenges, including wrongful arrest and the difficulty of linking similar cases across different regions. The unresolved murders continue to perplex authorities, leaving the Coastal Road Killer's identity and whereabouts a mystery. The Wagadu Axman. Yeah, that's how you pronounce that. This entry is referring to the Wagadu Axman, a brutal and still unsolved series of murders that took place from 2008 to 2011 in the Boumiougou district of Burkina Faso. During this period, a killer or possibly a gang targeted night watchmen and residents sleeping in their homes, using various weapons such as axes, stones, and iron bars to kill their victims. The first known murder occurred in December 2008, but details about this initial crime are scarce. The case's main characteristics involve the perpetrator using readily available items to commit the murders, with axes and stones being the most frequently used weapons. The killer killer often left the murder weapons at the scene, seemingly to taunt the police and investigators. This behavior earned the perpetrator the nickname the Axman. Some specific victims included Adama Bande, a driver from that, killed on August 5, 2009, with an axe stolen from a nearby property. Marceline Cabri, a 17-year-old found dead on October 2010 with her skull crushed by a large stone, and Mahadami Nikiema, who survived an attack on November 13, 2010, after being ambushed and severely injured by a machete-wielding assailant. Another victim, a night watchman, was found dead next to a mosque in early January 2011, with an axe left at the scene. The killings sparked widespread fear and panic in the district, with residents forming self-defense squads and taking various precautions, such as enforcing curfews and upgrading their homes' security measures. Despite several arrests and a dismantling of gangs believed to have committed similar crimes, the police never definitively identified the Wagadu Axman, and the case remains unsolved. Theories about the motives behind the murders range from ritual killings to fetishism, but the police believe the crimes were likely carried out by a gang under the influence of narcotics, specifically cocaine. The killer or killers appeared to be intimately familiar with the area, suggesting a local origin. The final victim count is believed to be around 15, with no new attacks reported after January 2011. Despite extensive investigations and patrols, the residents remain without closure, and the true identity of the Wagadu Axman remains a mystery. This entry refers to the Suitland serial murders, a series of brutal killings of young black women that occurred between October 1986 and January 1987 in Suitland, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The killer targeted slender, short-haired women, sexually assaulting them and stabbing them. The first victim, 20-year-old Dorothy Ann Miller, was found dead in December 1986, with the autopsy revealing that she had been raped and died from a drug overdose. Subsequent victims included 25-year-old Pamela Malcolm, 22-year-old Cynthia Lee Westbury, 26-year-old Juanita Mary Walls, and 22-year-old Angela Maria Wilkerson, all of whom were found in a wooded area near the Bradbury Recreational Center in January 1987. All victims had been sexually assaulted and stabbed, with their bodies in various states of decomposition. In mid-January 1987, the Prince George's County Police Department formed a task force to investigate the murders, interviewing numerous witnesses and searching Red Light District for leads. They discovered that some of the victims frequented the same areas, leading to an initial theory that they knew each other, which was later disproved. On January 30, 1987, police identified Alton Alonso Best, a 30-year-old unemployed man from DC, as a suspect. Best was already charged with the murder of 20-year-old Janice Elaine Morden, and while he was never formally linked to the Suitland murders, the killing stopped following his arrest. Best's connection to the victims was circumstantial, including his past criminal record involving armed robbery and kidnapping, and his drug addiction, which he shared with at least one of the victims. Despite being a prime suspect, no forensic evidence directly linked him to the murders. Best ultimately pleaded guilty to Morden's murder, receiving an 18-year prison sentence. Although the Suitland murders ceased after his arrest, the police and media have speculated that Best was likely the killer. Investigations into other murders in DC and Los Angeles around the same time did not definitively connect Best to those crimes, and the true identity of the Suitland serial killer remains unresolved. This entry refers to the 1996 serial murders, a series of 6 murders and several rapes targeted towards female residents of North Carolina from January to December 1996. Authorities initially believed these killings to be the work of a single serial killer. A homeless drifter named John Williams Jr. was arrested and convicted for 2 of the murders, and was considered a prime suspect in the other cases. However, evidence later revealed that multiple perpetrators were involved, with Lehman Evans convicted for the murder of Dewana Burt. The remaining murders of Dawn Grandy, Cynthia Brown, and Patricia Woods remain unsolved. The murder started on January 7, 1996, when 33-year-old Patricia Ash's body was found strangled on a bench. On January 17, Dewana Burt was found with a gunshot wound to the head in a parking lot. Patricia Wood's body was discovered on June 13 in Oakwood Cemetery. On July 13, Dawn Mary Grandy was found at a homeless camp under the Morgan Street Bridge. Cynthia Lewis Brown, initially unidentified, was found dead in August and identified the following January. The last known victim, Deborah Jean Elliott, was found nude on December 26, 1996. The police, fearing a serial killer, investigated the murders with the assistance of the FBI, conducting over 6,000 interviews and increasing surveillance. The investigation led to the arrest of Leeman Evans in January 1997 for Dewana Burt's murder, to which she confessed and received a prison sentence of 23 to 27 months. In February 1997, John Williams Jr. was arrested after attacking a woman named Shelley Jackson, who managed to escape and alert police. Williams was found wandering with blood in his shirt and was identified by Jackson. Williams had a prior rape conviction from Georgia. While awaiting trial for the attempted murder charge, he was additionally charged with the murders of Patricia Ash and Deborah Elliott, with DNA evidence linking him to the crime scenes and other rapes. During Williams' trial in January 1998, the defense argued that he was not in the right state of mind during the murders due to a traumatic childhood and low IQ. Okay. However, the jury found Williams guilty, and he was sentenced to death for both murder and convicted in the rape of 2 other women. As of 2023, Williams remains on North Carolina's death row. 1975 London serial murders. In 1975, 2 women in London, Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon, were murdered in sexually motivated attacks by the same unidentified killer. Stratford, a Playboy Club bunny, was found dead on March 18, 1975, in her Leighton flat with her throat cut. Whedon, a 16-year-old schoolgirl, was attacked on September 3, 1975, in Hounslow and died a week later from blunt force trauma. The cases went cold until 2004, when DNA evidence linked the 2 murders. Despite renewed investigations and public appeals, including features on BBC Crime Watch, the killer remains unidentified. Police also considered the 1977 murder of Elizabeth Paravinchina, killed in similar circumstances near Whedon's attack site, as possibly linked. A €40,000 reward is offered for information leading to the killer's capture. This case does contain a lot of grisly details that I won't be getting into, so yeah. The Cop Killer of Harbin. This entry refers to the case of the Cop Killer of Harbin, a series of murders targeting police officers in the Harbin region, specifically in Ulan County and one fat town in Bayan County during the late 1980s. The perpetrator, motivated by a personal vendetta against a police officer named He Rushin, committed these heinous acts to both exact revenge and divert police attention. The sequence of events is as follows. On June 5, 1987, in Subao Township, Ulan County, police officer Shang Fugu and 3 family members were brutally murdered, with Shang's Type 54 pistol stolen. On October 12, 1987, in one fat town, Bayan County, police station chief He Rushin and town officials So Shushin were killed. The killer's weapon malfunctioned, leading to a hand-to-hand struggle. On October 27, 1987, in Ulan County, Police Office Deputy Director Ma Fulin and his family were murdered, and another Type 54 pistol was stolen. On December 27, 1987, Police Officer Shu Hai was ambushed and killed outside the home of Deputy Police Chief Dong Xiao in Ulan County. On February 15, 1988, Judicial Police Officer Liu was murdered near his home in Ulan County after a struggle with the killer. So the investigation concluded that the perpetrator likely harbored a personal grudge against He Rushin, making him the primary target. The murders of Shang Fugu and Ma Fulin were primarily for the purpose of stealing firearms. The subsequent murders near Ulan City were meant to mislead the police into believing the killer was operating locally rather than from outside the area. This strategy involved selecting random police officers to kill in order to obscure the true motive and identity identity of the perpetrator. Key findings from the case include the use of different weapons, including knives and axes, in the murders, and the fact that the killer left behind significant evidence, such as fingerprints and items of clothing, which helped in piecing together his identity and movements. The killer's residence was deduced to be near Xubao Township, within 5 kilometers of a railway line, indicating a reliance on trains for movement and escape. Despite these insights, the killer was never captured, and the case remains an unsolved mystery in Chinese criminal history. The investigation, however, provided a detailed profile of the killer, including his physical characteristics and likely motivations, highlighting the complexities involved in such serial crimes. The Addison County 3. This entry is referring to the Addison County 3, a triple homicide cold case from 1935 in Vermont. On May 15, 1935, Mary Daig and her daughter, Ines Perry, discovered skeletal remains while walking in the woods outside Middlebury, Vermont. Initially mistaking the remains for a rock, they uncovered the bodies of a mother and her 2 children. The victims were identified as a mother aged 35 to 45 and her 2 children aged 9 to 11 and 13 to 15. All 3 had suffered gunshot wounds to the skull. The bodies were found on a remote logging road leading to the Brookins Blackmer hunting camp in East Middlebury. They were discovered under a thin layer of pine needles and leaves, bound in what was described as an army duffel bag. Evidence at the scene included remnants of a silk dress, a wooden blanket, and a flattened .38 caliber bullet. Sheriff Ralph Sweet led the investigation. They conducted a nationwide search and followed multiple leads. Initial suspects included R.R. Luding and a mysterious man named Irving or Arthur Denton. Another person of interest was Harold Yong, a bootlegger, but no conclusive links were found. The investigation identified potential victims like Cora Golden and her child, who disappeared in 1923. However, further investigations revealed that one of the children was found alive, disproving this theory. Another lead involved the French pseudonym used by Cora and her partner, where archival records and DNA testing eventually ruled out the Golden family. Despite extensive efforts, the identities of the victims remain unknown. The mother and her 2 sons were buried in a Middlebury cemetery with a grave marker reading 3 souls known only to God. The case remains unsolved, with archival records and modern forensic techniques offering hope for future breakthroughs. After 80 years, the Addison County 3 cold case remains a mystery. The victims' identities and the circumstances surrounding their deaths are still unknown, leaving this historic triple homicide unsolved. The Grand Rapids Prostitute Murders. This entry is referring to a series of at least 11 murders that took place between 1994 and 1996 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The victims were primarily women involved in prostitution and drug addiction. The murders began in March 1994 and continued until the last confirmed murder in October 1996. The methods of killing included strangulation, beating, and stabbing. The case saw the discovery of several bodies, often in advanced stages of decomposition, making identification and investigation difficult. Despite extensive efforts, including the formation of a special task force, the identity of the serial killer remains unknown. Key evidence, such as skeletal remains and personal effects, did not lead to conclusive identifications or arrests. The investigation revealed that many victims had connections to a local social service organization, but despite interviewing numerous suspects, no charges were brought against anyone. The task force was disbanded in 1997, and the case remains unsolved. 1993 Harbor City Serial Shootings. This entry is referring to the Harbor City serial shootings, an unsolved series of drive-by shootings in the Harbor City neighborhood of California during early 1993. The shootings resulted in the deaths of 3 black men and the wounding of another within a 2-block radius. The first shooting occurred on January 31, 1993, followed by another on February 14, a third on April 15, and the final incident on May 22. The surviving victim and witnesses described the perpetrator as a red-haired white man, aged 25 to 35, driving a red Jeep with a white top. Despite these detailed descriptions and the creation of a composite sketch, the shooter remains unidentified. The motive for the shootings is unclear, although police ruled out robbery. The possibility of racial motivation remains uncertain, given that all the victims were black. The case remains unsolved to this day. The Kauai serial killer. This entry is referring to the series of violent crimes committed by an unidentified individual known as the Kauai serial killer, who was active in 2000 on the island of Kauai, Hawaii. This perpetrator is responsible for the murders of two women, Lisa Bissell and Darren Singer, and the severe assault of another 52-year-old woman. The attacks included sexual assault, and the victims were middle-aged Caucasian women who were alone at the time of their attacks. The first victim, Lisa Bissell, was found dead in April near Polly Hill State Park. She had been raped, beaten, and stabbed to death. In May, the second victim was attacked in her yard, beaten, sexually assaulted, and stabbed, but she survived. The third victim, Darren Singer, was discovered at a remote campsite in August, having been raped and fatally stabbed. Despite a composite sketch of the killer, witness accounts, and the availability of DNA evidence, the killer has never been identified or apprehended. The prime suspect, Waldorf Roy Wilson, was investigated, but his DNA results were inconclusive, and he was never charged with the murders. The case was featured in the media, including on America's Most Wanted, but remains unsolved. Also, the sketch is pretty spooky. Just look at this thing. 1965-66 Columbus Murders. This entry is referring to the Columbus Murders, a series of 4 shootings that occurred in Columbus, Ohio, and surrounding areas between 1965 and 1966. 3 of the shootings were fatal, and all were connected via ballistic evidence, yet no suspect was ever identified, leaving the cases cold to this day. The first incident took place on September 3, 1965, when gas station attendant Raymond Sigler was shot and injured but survived. He described his attacker as a young white man, but the description was too general to be useful. The first fatal shooting happened on October 2, 1965, when 19-year-old Chester Joseph Scowden was killed at a gas station. His wallet and some money were missing, suggesting a possible robbery motive. On November 11, 1965, Claude Quisenberry was shot and killed at another gas station. Despite some money being taken, a significant amount was left behind, casting doubt that robbery was the sole motive. Ballistic tests linked this shooting to Scowden's murder. The final shooting occurred between May 22 and 23, 1966, when Loring Bollinger, an aeronautical engineering professor, was found dead with multiple gunshot wounds. Ballistics connected his murder to the previous 2 fatalities. Despite significant investigation efforts, including publicizing a facial composite and descriptions of the suspect, no arrests were made and the case remains unsolved. The Sacramento Mad Killer. This entry is referring to a string of violent crimes known as the Sacramento Mad Killer incidents, which took place between 1940 and 1941 in the Sacramento area. During this time, at least 5 middle-aged men were murdered, and 1 survived an attack. Despite multiple bodies being discovered in various states of decomposition and violent deaths, the killer was never identified. The sequence of events began in June 1940 with the discovery of a highly decomposed body in a field in Sutter County, with another body found nearby in August 1941. These early victims were never identified, and their connections to the later killings remain speculative. In August 1941, 2 men were found severely beaten. One of them, Alfred Reed, later died from his injuries. Another victim, Raymond Rivas, was found dead with his head crushed and his pockets emptied. A friend of Rivas, Tony Ochoa, disappeared around the same time, adding complexity to the case. The final known victim was discovered in the Sacramento River with possible gunshot wounds to the skull, though identification and cause of death were obscured by water damage and animal activity. Each victim had reportedly been last seen at local bars or in Sacramento's West End before being taken to isolated areas, robbed, and murdered. Investigators considered various suspects, including paroled convicts and other violent offenders, but none were definitively linked to the murders. The series of articles detailing these events and investigations ceased abruptly in September 1941, and the identity of the Sacramento Mad Killer remains unknown. The Stofers in Fire. The Stouffer's Inn fire occurred on December 4, 1980 at the Stouffer's Inn of Westchester in West Harrison, New York, resulting in the deaths of 26 people. It is considered the biggest disaster in Westchester County history. The fire began around 10:13 a.m. in a third-story conference area where approximately 95 occupants were attending meetings. The fire did not spread to the hotel's guest room facilities. The structure was actually fire-resistant but not equipped with sprinklers and was classified as a place of assembly. The fire rapidly blocked escape routes and engulfed the conference area in flames and toxic smoke, including carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and nitrogen dioxide. Many victims were trapped due to quickly worsening conditions and impeded exits. For instance, casualties in the North Corridor were found in nearly single file, indicating their failed attempt to escape, and 2 additional victims were found near the Height Room's doorway. In the comment, fatalities were discovered near locked promenade doors, suggesting they died attempting to escape. Investigators concluded the fire was arson, ignited by flammable liquid on the carpet at a corridor intersection. This determination was supported by evidence of unusually intense fire behavior that cannot be explained by ordinary material burning. Despite the investigation, the case remains unresolved, with no arrests made. The tragedy led to discussions about fire safety standards, especially regarding sprinkler systems and accessible exits in public assembly buildings. The Top of the Hill Bar Shooting. The Top of the Hill Bar Shooting, also known as Annie's Bar Massacre, was a mass shooting that occurred on December 20, 1972, during the Troubles in Derry, Northern Ireland. Members of the Ulster Defence Association, or the UDA, a loyalist paramilitary group, attacked the pub known for being frequented by Catholics, killing 5 civilians and injuring 4 others. The attack took place around 10:30 p.m. at the Top of the Hill Bar on Strabane Old Road, a Catholic neighborhood in the predominantly Protestant waterside area of Derry. 2 gunmen, one with a Sterling submachine gun and the other with a pistol, entered the pub during a football match and opened fire indiscriminately. The victims included 4 Catholic civilians and 1 Protestant civilian. This attack was viewed as a revenge for the killing of the Ulster Defence Regiment soldier by a provisional IRA sniper earlier that day. It was one of the deadliest attacks by the UDA during the Troubles and marked a significant point of sectarian violence in Derry, a city that had been relatively less affected by the conflict compared to Belfast. Despite the severity of the attack, no one was ever charged and the case remains unresolved. In recent years, there have been calls for a new investigation into the massacre. The Guaralhos Strangler. The Guaralhos Maniac, or Guaralhos Strangler, is an unidentified serial killer and rapist responsible for the deaths of at least 10 women in Guaralhos, Sao Paulo, Brazil, between 2001 and 2002. His modus operandi involved posing as a property buyer or a utility worker to gain access to the homes of his victims, whom he predominantly targeted when they were alone. The killer used the victims' own clothing to strangle them and often laughed during the attacks, suggesting a deep-seated hatred for women. He also occasionally robbed his victims of appliances. Described as a paunchy white male around 30 years old, with bowed blonde hair and a scar on the right side of his mouth, he operated strategically, scouting and preparing escape route ahead of his attacks. Despite the arrest of 2 suspects in October 2002, the case remains unresolved. 1 suspect was dismissed by a victim due to shock, and the outcome of the recognition process for the 2nd suspect remains unclear. In December 2002, another man was arrested following an anonymous tip found in his possession were pornographic materials and disturbing items. However, further details on his involvement or any subsequent legal proceedings have not been disclosed. The case of the Guaralhos Strangler is particularly chilling due to the calculated nature of the attacks and the psychological torment inflicted on the victims and their community. Despite several arrests, the true identity of the killer remains unknown, and he has not been found or apprehended, leaving a haunting legacy of fear and unresolved grief in Guaralhos. The Dacian Child Murderer. The Dacian child murderer case involves a series of disturbing incidents in the early 1990s in the South Province of South Korea, specifically in the town of Daishan. This area witnessed several tragic events where infants and young children were abducted from their homes during the night, and some were later found dead with signs of severe injury. The first known incident occurred on August 16, 1991, when a 2-month-old boy was abducted and later found in a nearby stream, injured but alive. The subsequent cases grew progressively grimmer, with another child abducted in February 1992, found hours later but passing away after 2 months. In June 1992, another horrifying event took place where a 4-month-old girl was kidnapped and later discovered with fatal injuries. The sequence of events culminated in September 1992 with the abduction of a 5-day-old girl who was never found. These incidents terrorized the community, particularly because the perpetrator targeted very young children, striking on the 16th of a month under cover of early morning hours and during inclement weather. The suspect appeared to have intimate knowledge of the local area and exploited the residents' vulnerability due to poorly secured homes and a lack of effective local law enforcement. Despite an intensive search and investigation, including questioning and clearing of several suspects and theories ranging from a sexual predator to someone with a medical condition seeking remedies through superstitions, the case remains unsolved. The statute of limitations has expired, meaning that even if the perpetrator were identified, they could not be prosecuted under South Korean law. It's pretty dumb, but yeah. The East Lancs Ripper. This entry is referring to the unsolved case of the East Lancs Ripper, an unidentified serial killer suspected of multiple murders in the northwest of England near East Lancashire Road during the late 1980s and early 1990s. 2 of the victims linked to this case are Linda Donaldson and Maria Christina Requena. Linda Donaldson was found dead on October 18, 1988, exhibiting severe mutilation, including multiple post-mortem stab wounds and an attempted decapitation. Maria Christina Requena was discovered on January 6, 1991 in Pennington Flash Lake. Her body had been dismembered using a saw and placed in plastic bags. Both victims were last seen working as sex workers, and their personal belongings were missing. The case, characterized by extreme violence and the targeting of vulnerable women, remains open despite extensive police investigation and public appeals, including a televised BBC Crime Watch reconstruction. In recent developments, the case was reopened and new interviews were conducted. That Ripper. For this entry, I was only able to find this article on the serial killer database wiki, and it had no information on it, so let's move on. The Capitol Hill Thug. I was only able to find very limited information on this entry as expected. It's referring to this case about this guy nicknamed the Denver Thug that killed several women in the 1900s. The manner in which the women were killed was very similar for each murder, but yeah, the guy apparently attacked several women in a single night, leaving a pretty big scar on the community at the time. It's a really obscure case. The Parana Murders. This entry is referring to a series of tragic events involving the disappearances and murders of children in Parana, Brazil during the 1980s and 1990s. The cases of Sandra Luz, Leandro Bossi, and Evandro Caetano are particularly notable due to their gruesome nature and the mystery surrounding their deaths. Sandra, an 11-year-old girl, disappeared in 1989 after attending a party. She was later found dead with severe mutilations. Leandro, aged 7, vanished in 1992 during a concert, and his remains were mistakenly identified years later due to a mix-up in DNA testing. Evandro, also 7, went missing in 1992 and was found dead with signs of violent treatment and organ removal. These cases gained notoriety due to allegations involving local political figures and accusations of satanic rituals, which led to controversial trials marked by claims of police torture and procedural mismanagement. The media frenzy and judicial chaos surrounding these events obscured the facts and hindered justice, highlighting systemic issues in Brazilian law enforcement. Despite extensive investigations and public interest, the true circumstances surrounding these deaths remains unsolved, illustrating the complexity of solving such sensitive cases amid widespread panic and misinformation. And finally, the Croydon Poisoner. This entry refers to the intriguing case of the South Croydon poisonings in the 1920s, where a woman named Grace Duff, suspected of multiple murders within her family, appeared to escape justice. A descendant of a former Lord Mayor of London and blessed with a great beauty and social connections, Grace married Edmund Duff, whose dismissal from a well-paid civil service job led to a drastic reduction in their lifestyle. The mysterious deaths began with their 2-year-old daughter Suzanne, followed by their wealthy house guest Anna Maria Kelvey. Edmund Duff died under suspicious circumstances in 1928 after returning from a fishing trip in agony similar to that which later claimed the lives of Grace's sister Vera and mother Violet, both of whom suspected they were being poisoned. These deaths coincidentally benefited Grace financially through inheritances and insurance payouts. The local coroner appeared unusually sympathetic to Grace during the inquests, raising questions about possible complicity. Suspicions also arose about her relationship with the family doctor who handled all the medical cases and death certificates. Despite the alarming pattern and accusations, Grace Duff was never formally charged, leading to speculation of her having an affair with someone influential or using her charm to manipulate those around her. Alright, that was part 1. I don't know what to say for this outro apart from I guess subscribe if you somehow enjoyed and want to stick around for part 2, the last tier. I'm not guaranteeing that I will do it, but I'm probably gonna do it. Anyways, see you in a week or 2 or whenever I come back.